Everybody, welcome back to the show. I wanted to take this time to tell you a bit about structural transformation of the public sphere, Jürgen Habermas's academically famous book. It's not a famous book per se, but academically famous book. And in this book, which he wrote after World War II, he was interested in the rise of the public sphere, the ideal of the public sphere, which I'll talk about in just a second, as well as the history of the public sphere. His argument historically was that there was no such thing as public sphere interchange in a world before democracy, which is to say largely the world before the Enlightenment of 1650 to 1800. Usually power was expressed by kings or feudal lords or perhaps church potentates and such as a power over or a dominion over. So if you think about a public execution was there to display the power of the state over the people. There was no opportunity in a public sphere exchange for people to speak back to the powerful unless it was in the form of a violent revolution, perhaps. And so what Habermas was interested in was the growth of the public sphere in the sense of more and more and more people getting the opportunity to participate. But the structural transformation of the public sphere, his book, is also a book about theory. It's also a book about the public sphere as a standard to evaluate the health of a democracy. And he says that the healthiest public spheres have 6 characteristics, and I've written these down so that I won't forget them all in this one video. The first characteristic of a healthy public sphere, of an ideal public sphere, is universal access. What universal access means is that everybody who lives in a particular place gets to participate in the governance of that particular place. They get a say, in a sense, and that could mean votes, or that could mean they all have the same free speech rights. Everybody has access to Twitter accounts, or whatever the case may be. They have access to participation. And if you think of just the history of the United States, we have had lots of instances where groups of people based on gender, or based on race, or based on other characteristics did not have access to the public sphere at a very minimum in terms of voting rights, but also in terms of free speech rights and the ability to give a public speech and not violate some local ordinance. The second characteristic of an ideal public sphere would be that people debate as equals. What Habermas meant by this was that they bracket their status differences. If you think about a situation in which you felt like you were talking to somebody, maybe it was a public official, maybe it was somebody who has power, esteemed power in your family or something, and you didn't feel like there were things that you could say because there might be repercussions down the line. That is an example of not bracketing our status differences, not debating as equals. So what Habermas wanted to make sure is that if we're all getting into a room and making a decision about collective life here at the College of Charleston, that students and professors, or that professors and the provost or the president, are able to put aside their titles and debate as equal members, equal citizens of any particular community, if that makes sense. The third characteristic of an ideal public sphere for Habermas would be freedom from coercion. And what that means is that there's no negative consequences or fears of negative consequences that would arise if I make a particular decision. In other words, if a sheriff of a particular town, of a hypothetical fascist small town, wants to make sure that everybody votes for candidate X, and if they find out that you haven't voted for candidate X, then there's going to be consequences down the road to you or to your family, then that would not be a situation in which, obviously an extreme situation, but that would not be a situation in which there would be freedom from coercion and people were able to debate only as if what they had a stake in their democracy mattered. They would be debating, in that hypothetical example, instead based on fear. The fourth example, the fourth characteristic of an ideal public sphere is access to information, that everybody has equal access to information. And this could be the health of our media is at play here, but it's also about just the amount of information that we have too. So for instance, in Charleston, in the entirety of the slave owning era in Charleston, for instance, let's say 1848, it was incredibly difficult to get abolitionist literature from the North into Charleston because the mail was controlled. And the mail was controlled in such a way as to inhibit free access to abolitionist material. This is just one example of many that you can possibly imagine in which access to information could prevent great debate from happening in an ideal public sphere. The fifth characteristic of an ideal public sphere is public education. And this doesn't mean that everybody is educated equally and that schools are equalized across the board, but it does mean that everybody has access to public education, because it's not just the case that you can get the information. If you're not educated to know what to do with the information, then people who are educated are going to have a far bigger advantage in a public debate over, say, immigration or what we should do about North Korea than people who didn't have access and didn't have any public education. And finally, the final characteristic of an ideal public sphere is critical, rational debate. That is, that the decision-making that happens and the information that is exchanged in the course of a public debate, everybody has more or less agreed to debate in a critical and rational way, which means, and Habermas's phrase here is key. He says that decisions should be made by the force of the better argument. So if you imagine yourself having a debate with your friends about something simple like where to go to dinner, and you bring out a series of arguments about what kind of food people prefer or what people's budgets are, and therefore you should go to this restaurant and not that restaurant, and you feel like the facts are on your side and you've given good reasons, but somebody just puts their foot down and yells or threatens not to go to dinner or tries to shame people or bully people into going to one restaurant instead of the other one, and then that person, the bully, ends up winning, that would not be the presence of critical, rational debate, right? So instead, that would be debate based on trolling or bullying or yelling or throwing a fit instead of critical, rational debate. Those are the 6 characteristics, and I'll have those explained in simple language too in the next few slides.